its interesting situation in the Canadian political landscape, and then we'll talk about the current Quebec political landscape and what you're endeavoring to achieve.
Thank you very much for welcoming me. Well, you want me to talk about Quebec? For those who are not aware, of course, we're the French province in Canada. 23% of Canadians. Politically speaking, over the last 50 years, Quebec has been a battleground between the separatists and the federalists. So there's those who wanted Quebec to separate from Canada and those who wanted Quebec to stay within Canada. For many decades, since I was born, we've always been fighting between those two political sides. And now the political landscape is changing in Quebec slowly but surely. There were two defeats for the yes side, so for the separatist side, in 1980 and in 1995. And that's where probably many people all around the world heard the most about Quebec, because it was a very, very tight result, especially in 95, where it was like not even 51% against 49.4%. So that's been a huge political thing going on, but nowadays there's not as much appetite, especially not among the youngest generation, to talk about those divisive issues. We're elsewhere, and we see that the two old parties that used to split us between federalists and separatists, the yes camp and the no camp, are melting down. And now we have 5 political parties. It's very, very unusual for the kind of system that we're in. And so there's 5 main political parties in this upcoming election at the provincial level. There's one socialist party, Québec Solidaire. There's the governing party, the Coalition Avenir Québec, which is a nationalist centrist party. There's the Liberals, who are the former Federalist side, who are still Federalists, but more leaning on the left as well. And the Separatist party historically, with the Parti Québécois, who's also more on the left of the political spectrum. So it's a very, very interesting period of time in our history, politically speaking, and this election could be a very historical election that is going to mark the end of a cycle and hopefully the beginning of a new one.
Yeah, Canada's been a somewhat difficult country to cobble together because of the linguistic divide, because of the massive scale of the geographic enterprise, and because of the distinction and differences between the French civil law system and the English common law system. And so it's been a real tricky balancing act for Canadians to keep the country unified from coast to coast, with Quebec sitting not precisely in the middle, but approximately in the middle. And so, as Mr. Duhaime said, that just about came to destruction twice in the last 45 years. We escaped with our country intact by the narrowest of margins. It might be of some interest for people listening to know that in many ways, and please correct me if you believe my interpretation to be incomplete, Quebec was one of the last countries, so to speak, nations in the Western world that underwent the transition from traditional Catholicism to modernity. The awakening in Quebec, let's say, occurred in the late 1950s. Before that, Quebec was an extremely traditional Catholic enclave with extremely large families. I did genetic research in Quebec for quite a long time, and it was very common for the older people in our research samples to have had 10 siblings, so very large families. And so Quebec was united on the French side and very tightly kin related, because Quebec was also settled by a relatively small number of French settlers. And so Quebec was also a tightly kin related society. And the French were under the rubric of this intense Catholicism. The English in Quebec had more financial power, generally speaking, although they were a very small minority of people compared to the French. In the 60s, Catholicism dissolved precipitously. Church attendance plummeted. Family size crashed to the point where in many recent decades, Quebec has had one of the lowest birth rates in the Western world. The marriage rate collapsed. And along with that collapse, interestingly enough, there was a real rise in nationalism. And to me, it's always been the case that that was sort of a microcosm in many ways of what also happened in Europe. As classical Christianity deteriorated, other systems of group-fostered belief flourished. And part of what drove Quebec separatism was, in some real sense, a substitute for the religious impulse that had united Quebecois before. I talked to a Gallup pollster, it was probably 20 years ago. He answered a question I always had been curious about. He said that their research had indicated that if you were a lapsed Catholic in Quebec compared to a continual churchgoer, let's say, and someone who maintained their faith, you were 5 times more likely to be an advocate for separatism. And now Mr. Duhaime has pointed out that in recent years, and that would be post-1995, when we had the last referendum on Quebec separatism, the Quebec separatist cause has attracted less and less fervor, especially among the young. And you mentioned to me in a bit of a brief conversation that we had before this podcast started that the Conservatives have actually started to become more popular. They're showing their greatest growth in popularity among people who are relatively young in Quebec, which is really not what you'd expect. So maybe you could explain a little bit about how you see the relative demographics and positions of the various political parties in Quebec.
Well, first off, I want to talk to you about the as you rightly pointed out, what we call it here was the Quiet Revolution in the late 50s, early 60s, when that shift happened, when the Catholic Church lost control at a certain extent of what was going on in Quebec, and where the nanny state became, growing and growing. That's been happening for the last 50 years. So there was a complete shift, and Quebec didn't do anything different from other societies, except that it was done much faster. Like it was a fast track of everything that we observed in the Western world. We did it in a very short period of time. Why so? Probably because we're a more homogeneous people, and so that's probably why the shift happened so quickly. And that being said, the impact politically, as you said, was that the Anglophones who were dominant, economically speaking, there was a shift on that side as well with the growth of the nationalist and the separatist movement. And I want to make sure here that we differentiate nationalism and separatism in Quebec. I define myself as a nationalist, which means that I'm proud of being Francophone. I do believe that the common language in Quebec is French, and I think that even Anglophones agree with that here in Quebec. There's 1 million non-Francophones in Quebec who choose to stay here. And the profile of those people